Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio is a collection of short stories written by Pu Songling during the Qing Dynasty. These tales often revolve around themes of fox spirits, ghosts, and other supernatural beings. The complete illustrated Liaozhai, like Quantu, is a series of colorful illustrated comic-style books that depict the stories from Liaozhai Ji. This collection originally consisted of around 90 volumes, scattered across various institutions worldwide. The content in this video features 17 volumes archived at the Austrian National Library and 1 volume preserved at the Martin Bodmer Library in Geneva, Switzerland. These illustrations are believed to date back to the late Qing Dynasty, likely during the Guangxu period. In our last episode, we discussed the stories from volume 48. Today we will continue with 4 stories from volume 53. Xi Fangping, 3 Lives, Long Pavilion, and Xi Fangping. Special thanks to Little Fish, a member of the Eastern Brush Western Soul channel, for their selfless contribution in translating and compiling these ancient texts for everyone. Xi Fangping. Xi Fangping was a man from Pingliang, Gansu province. Renowned for his literary talents, he consistently failed the imperial examinations. One day, while traveling, he encountered a scholar who introduced himself as Lang. Lang was refined in demeanor and articulate in speech. Xi Fangping invited Lang to his home, where he presented his essays for critique. After reading them, Lang offered faint praise and remarked, "Your writing is more than sufficient to top the provincial exams, but it wouldn't even scrape the bottom of the list in the metropolitan exams." Xi Fangping asked, "What should I do then?" Lang replied, "In this world, it's hard to reach for lofty goals by straining and tiptoeing, but lowering oneself is much easier. Do I even need to explain such a principle?" Lang then pointed out a couple of individuals and their essays as examples, works Xi Fangping held in contempt and found unworthy of mention. Xi Fangping laughed and said, "The value of a scholar's writing lies in its endurance through time. Even if it's considered a delicacy among the finest, it should never be viewed as an overreach. As for those individuals you mentioned, using such subpar works to gain fame and fortune may lead to high office, but they remain base and vulgar." Lang countered, "That's not how it works. Some people's excellent essays remain obscure simply because of their low status. If you're content to cling to your scrolls for the rest of your life, so be it. Otherwise, bear in mind that even the examiners themselves rose to their positions using such mediocre works. They won't change their perspectives just because they see your superior essays." Xi Fangping was left speechless. Lang laughed as he stood up, saying, "Ah, you're still so headstrong." Then he bid farewell. That year, Xi Fangping once again failed the provincial exams. Dejected and frustrated, he began recalling Lang's words and reluctantly picked up the essays Lang had pointed out earlier. However, before finishing them, he found himself drowsy, unsure whether to follow Lang's advice. 3 years later, as the provincial exams approached, Lang unexpectedly visited again. The two greeted each other warmly. Lang then produced 7 essay topics he had prepared and asked Xi Fangping to compose essays on them. After a day, Lang reviewed Xia's essays, but found them unsatisfactory, prompting him to rewrite them. When Xia submitted the rewritten versions, Lang still disapproved. Out of frustration, Xia decided to make a joke. He gathered his failed essays from previous attempts and pieced together the most verbose, meaningless, and pretentious sections into a single essay. When Lang returned, Xia handed it over. To his surprise, Lang was delighted and declared, "This time it's perfect." Lang instructed Xia to memorize the essay thoroughly and repeatedly warned him not to forget it. Xia laughed, saying, "To be honest, this isn't what I genuinely want to write. I'll forget it in no time. Even if I were beaten, I couldn't recall it." Lang sat by the desk and forced Xia to recite it. Then he had Xia remove his upper garment, inscribed a charm on his back, and said before leaving, "This will suffice. You can put away all your other books." When Xia inspected his back, he found the charm deeply imprinted into his skin, unable to be washed away. On the day of the provincial exam, Xia entered the examination hall. To his astonishment, the 7 essay topics were precisely those Lang had prepared. Despite racking his brain, Xia could not recall any of his previous writings. The only essay that came to mind was the one he had jokingly pieced together. He hesitated to write it, feeling it was humiliating. But after struggling to revise it, he found himself unable to change even a single word. As the sun tilted westward, Jia had no choice but to submit the essay as it was. Upon exiting the hall, Lang was already waiting for him. "Why are you so late?" Lang asked. Jia recounted the entire experience and begged Lang to remove the charm from his back, but upon checking, the charm had already disappeared. The whole ordeal felt like a dream. In awe, Jia asked Lang, "Why don't you use such methods to pass the exams yourself?" Lang laughed and replied, "Because I have no such desire. That's why I'm free from these concerns." He invited Jia to visit him the next day, and Jia agreed. After Lang left, Jia reread the essay he had memorized. It was far from what he aspired to write, leaving him frustrated and dispirited. He broke his promise to visit Lang and returned home, despondent and disheartened. Not long after, the results of the provincial exams were announced, and Xi Fangping ranked among the top 3 to 5 candidates. He revisited the 7 essays Lang had prepared, and reading them left him drenched in sweat. By the end, several layers of his clothing were soaked through. He muttered to himself, "If such essays are revealed to the world, how will I ever face other scholars?" As he was overcome with shame, Lang suddenly arrived. "You wanted to pass the exam, and now you've succeeded. Why are you still so gloomy?" Xi Fangping replied, "I was just thinking, this is like serving dog feces in golden bowls. I have no face left to show among my peers. I plan to leave my family and retreat to the mountains, severing all ties with the world." Lang said, "That's quite admirable, but I doubt you'll manage it. If you truly can, I'll introduce you to someone who can teach you the secrets of immortality." With that, even a millennium of fame would seem trivial, let alone this undeserved wealth and status. Xi Fangping was intrigued and delighted. He asked Lang to stay the night, saying, "Let me think this through." By dawn, Xi Fangping informed Lang, "I've made up my mind." Without informing his wife or children, he left home without hesitation. The two of them ventured deep into the mountains and arrived at a cave dwelling. Inside, it opened into a different world. An elderly man sat in the hall, and Lang instructed Xi Fangping to bow and address him as master. The old man asked, "Why have you come so early?" Lang replied, "He has resolved to cultivate the way and hopes you will accept him as a disciple." The master said to Xi Fangping, "If you've come, you must disregard even your own body to attain the Tao." Xi Fangping politely agreed repeatedly. Lang escorted him to another courtyard, arranged a place for him to sleep, and brought him cakes to eat before leaving. The house was simple yet clean. However, there were no doors on the entrances or frames on the windows. Inside, it contained only a small desk and a bed. Xi Fangping took off his shoes, lay down, and noticed the moonlight streaming through the openings. Feeling slightly hungry, he ate some of the cakes, which tasted sweet and satisfying. He quickly felt full and thought Long might return. But after waiting a long while, the night remained silent. A faint fragrance filled the room, and Xi Fangping felt as if his organs had become transparent, with their veins and structures visible. Suddenly, he heard sharp noises outside, resembling a cat scratching. Looking out the window, he saw a tiger crouched under the eaves. At first, he was startled, but then he remembered the master's words and calmed himself, sitting still. The tiger seemed aware of his presence and entered the house. It approached the bed, sniffing his feet and legs thoroughly. Moments later, a commotion erupted in the courtyard, like a bound chicken flapping and crying. The tiger rushed out in pursuit. Xi Fangping sat for a while longer when suddenly a beautiful woman entered the room. Her fragrance filled the air as she silently climbed onto the bed. She leaned close to his ear and whispered, "I've come." Her breath carried a scent of lip balm. Xi Fangping kept his eyes shut and remained unmoved. The woman softly asked, "Are you asleep?" Her voice resembled that of his wife. Xi Fangping's heart wavered momentarily, but he thought, "This must be an illusion conjured by the master to test me." He kept his eyes closed. The woman laughed and said, "The mouse moved." Back when Xi Fangping lived with his wife and a maid, they used this phrase as a code to initiate intimacy without alarming the maid. Upon hearing it now, Xi Fangping's heart stirred deeply. He opened his eyes and saw, to his shock, truly was his wife. He asked, "How did you get here?" She replied, "Lang long thought you might feel lonely and regretful, so he sent an old woman to bring me here." As they spoke, she leaned into him, expressing her anger at his sudden departure. Xi Fangping spent a long time comforting her until she finally calmed down and they shared an intimate moment. By dawn, they heard the master's angry voice approaching the courtyard. Xi Fangping's wife hurriedly got up, but seeing no place to hide, she climbed over the low wall and fled. Not long after, Lang entered the room behind the master. In front of Xi Fangping, the master scolded Lang and struck him with a stick. He then ordered Lang to expel Xi Fangping. Lang had no choice but to lead Jia out through the low wall. Lang said, "I had high hopes for you and pushed you too hard. I didn't realize your emotional ties were unresolved, and now I've been punished as well. You should return home for now. We'll meet again soon enough." He pointed out the way home, and the two parted with a bow. Standing on the mountain, Xi Fangping looked down and saw his village right in front of him. Thinking his wife must still be on the road, given her slow pace, he hurried down a mile and reached his home. To his surprise, the house and courtyard were dilapidated, no longer the familiar place he had left. None of the elderly or children in the village recognized him, which filled him with unease. Suddenly, he remembered the story of Liu Chen and Ruan Zhao from the Han Dynasty, who, after encountering immortals on Tiantai Mountain, returned home to find everything changed. Unwilling to enter the house, Jia sat across the street to rest. After a while, an old man emerged from the house with a cane. Jia bowed and asked, "Where is Xi Fangping's home?" The old man pointed to the house and said, "This is it. Are you asking about that strange tale? I know it well. They say that Master Jia fled upon learning he had passed the provincial exams. At the time, his son was only 7 or 8 years old. Later, when his son was around 14 or 15, Madame Jia fell into a deep sleep and couldn't wake up. While her son was alive, he cared for her, changing her clothes as needed. But after his death, her 2 grandsons were so poor that they dismantled the house and built a simple shelter of wood and straw to shield her from the elements. About a month ago, she suddenly woke up and realized over a century had passed. People from far and wide came to see this marvel, but the visitors have lessened in recent days." Xi Fangping was struck with a sudden realization and said, "You don't understand. I am Xi Fangping." The old man was shocked and quickly went to inform the Jia family. By then, Xi Fangping's eldest grandson had already passed away, and his younger grandson, Jia Xiang, was over 50 years old. The family suspected Xi Fangping of being an imposter because of his youthful appearance. Before long, Madame Jia came out and recognized him instantly. Tears streamed down her face as she called him inside. The couple, however, found themselves with no home to call their own and had to temporarily stay in their grandson's house. Soon, men, women, and children filled the room. They were Xi Fangping's great-grandchildren and even great-great-grandchildren, most of whom were unrefined and ignorant. The eldest grandson's wife, Wu Shi, a well-educated and virtuous woman, treated the elderly couple with respect. She prepared wine and simple meals for them and vacated a room for them by having her youngest son, Jia Gao, and his wife move in with her. The cleared room was prepared for the grandparents, but it smelled of smoke and urine, making it unbearable. After a few days, Xi Fangping was filled with regret. The 2 grandsons alternated in providing meals, but the food often didn't suit their tastes. Villagers invited Xi Fangping to drink daily, intrigued by his miraculous return after 100 years, but Madame Jia frequently went hungry. Wu Shi remained dutiful and caring, but Jia Xiang's family became less attentive, sometimes needing to be loudly called upon before they reluctantly brought food. Frustrated, Xi Fangping decided to leave with his wife. They moved to the neighboring village and set up a school to teach. He often lamented to his wife, "Coming back home has been a mistake, but there's no undoing it now. We have no choice but to resume our old work. If I can overcome my feelings of shame, achieving wealth and success wouldn't be difficult." Over a year passed, and Wu Shi, the wife of Xi Fangping's eldest grandson, continued to send them occasional supplies. However, his second grandson, Jia Xiang, and his family completely severed contact with them. That same year, Xi Fangping passed the county-level examination and became a scholar, Shukai. The county magistrate, impressed by his literary talent, generously supported him financially, which allowed Jia's family to achieve some level of prosperity. Seeing this, Jia Shang attempted to rebuild ties with Xi Fangping. Xi Fangping called him in, calculated the cost of the food and resources Jia Shang had previously provided, paid him back in silver, and sternly dismissed him, forbidding any future interaction. He then purchased a new house and invited Wu Shi to move in with him and his wife. Wu Shi had 2 sons. Her eldest remained to manage the family's old estate, while her younger son, Jia Gao, showed great promise. Jia Fangping decided to have Jia Gao study alongside his other students. After returning from the mountains, Jia Fengji's mind became even sharper. He quickly passed the provincial and metropolitan exams in succession, eventually becoming a Jinshi, advanced scholar. A few years later, he was appointed as a supervisory censor, Jiancha Yushi, and sent to Zhejiang as an inspector. His reputation soared, and his household flourished with grand festivities, music, and dancing, becoming the talk of the region. However, Jia Fengping was known for his upright character and refusal to flatter powerful officials, which earned him the enmity of many high-ranking courtiers who sought to bring about his downfall. Despite repeatedly submitting petitions to resign and return home, the emperor denied his requests. Inevitably, calamity struck. Jia Xiang's 6 sons were infamous scoundrels. Although Jia Fengping ignored them and refused to let them into his home, they used his influence to oppress others, seizing land and homes from villagers. The local community regarded them as a blight. One particular incident involved a villager, referred to as Mo Yi, whose newlywed wife was forcibly taken by Jia Xiang's 2nd son as a concubine. Mo Yi, already cunning by nature, sought justice with the financial backing of the local community, and the case reached the capital. The scandal provided an opening for Jia Fengping's enemies in court. Officials filed repeated memorials accusing Jia Fengping, who found himself unable to defend against the onslaught. He was imprisoned for over a year, during which both Jia Xiang and his 2nd son succumbed to illness and died in jail. Later, Jia Fengping was sentenced to exile in Liaoyang. By then, Jia Gao had long been a scholar and was widely respected for his benevolent and virtuous nature. Jia Fengping entrusted his youngest son, who had recently turned 16, to Jia Gao's care. Accompanied by a male and a female servant, Jia Fengping and his wife set out for Liaoyang. On the journey, Jia Fengping lamented, "These fleeting years of wealth and glory were shorter than the span of a dream. Now I understand that the splendor of officialdom is nothing but a hellish realm. I regret having surpassed Liu Chen and Ruan Zhao in accumulating such sin." After traveling for several days, they arrived at the seaside. In the distance, they saw a massive ship approaching, accompanied by the sound of drums and music, with guards who appeared celestial. The ship docked, and a man disembarked, smiling warmly as he invited Jia Fengping aboard to rest. The moment Jia saw the man, he was overcome with joy and leapt onto the ship without hesitation. The officials escorting him dared not intervene. Madame Jia hurriedly tried to follow, but the ship had already sailed far from shore. Overcome with anger and despair, she flung herself into the sea. After floating only a short distance, a white silk rope was lowered from the ship, pulling her aboard. The officials immediately boarded a small boat and ordered the rowers to give chase, shouting as they pursued. Yet the great ship's drums thundered like a storm, echoing with the roaring waves, and in a moment it vanished from sight. One of Jia Fengping's servants recognized the man on the ship. It was none other than Lang Sheng. The second story of volume 53, 3 Lives, is about a person from Hunan province who can remember events from his past 3 lives. In his first life, he was a county magistrate and a co-examiner for the provincial examination. While reviewing the exam papers, he disqualified a well-known scholar named Xing Yutang. Filled with grief and resentment, Xing Yutang died and went to the underworld, where he took his exam paper to sue the magistrate. This lawsuit resonated with thousands of other wronged souls who had died under similar circumstances. They elected Xing Yutang as their leader and would gather in groups, crying out for justice. The underworld officials then summoned the magistrate to face Xing Yutang and the other spirits. The king of hell asked Since you were in charge of reviewing the exam papers, would you reject such a talented person and select the mediocre candidates instead? The magistrate defended himself, saying, I was merely executing the will of the chief examiner above me, not making the decisions myself. The king of hell then ordered his men to capture the chief examiner. After a long delay, the chief examiner was brought in. The king of hell relayed the magistrate's defense to him, and the chief examiner replied, I only summarized the results. Although some good essays were submitted, the room examiners failed to recommend them. So how could I have seen them? The king of hell declared, You cannot shift the blame onto each other. Both of you share equal responsibility for dereliction of duty, and according to the law, you will each receive a flogging. As the executioners prepared to carry out the punishment, Xing Yutang, dissatisfied with the lightness of the sentence, suddenly shouted, and the ghosts on either side of the steps joined in his cries. The king of hell asked them why they were shouting, and Xing Yutang protested, The flogging is too light. Their eyes should be gouged out as punishment for their failure to distinguish good essays from bad. The king of hell considered this request excessive and refused to comply, but the cries from the ghosts grew louder. The king of hell explained they did not wish to select poor essays, but their understanding was too shallow. The ghosts then demanded that their hearts and livers be removed. Reluctantly, the king of hell agreed. The executioners stripped the two men of their robes, and with sharp knives they cut open their chests. The two men screamed in agony as their blood flowed. The ghosts cheered in unison, saying, We, who suffered injustice in the underworld, have never had our grievances addressed until now. Thanks to Mr. Jing, our wrongs have finally been avenged. The ghosts then dispersed. After the execution, the magistrate was reincarnated into a common family in Shanxi. When he was in his 20s, the area was plagued by bandits, and he was captured during a raid. The government sent soldiers to suppress the bandits, and many prisoners, including the magistrate, were taken. He thought to himself, I'm not a bandit. I'll be able to explain myself during the interrogation. However, when he was brought to the courtroom, he was shocked to see that the magistrate presiding over the case was none other than Xing Yutang, his former adversary from his past life. He realized with alarm, this is the end for me. Indeed, all the other prisoners were released, but the magistrate was kept behind. Despite his attempts to plead his case, he was sentenced to be beheaded in public. After his death, the magistrate went to the underworld and filed a lawsuit against Xing Yutang for killing him unjustly. However, the king of hell did not immediately order his arrest, waiting for Xing Yutang to enjoy the benefits of his position. 30 years later, Xing Yutang was finally apprehended and brought before the magistrate for questioning. Xing Yutang was found guilty of murder and sentenced to be reincarnated as a beast. Upon investigation, it was also revealed that the magistrate had once punished Xing Yutang's parents. Therefore, the two were found to share equal blame for their wrongdoings. Fearing that Xing Yutang might take revenge in his next life, the magistrate requested to be reincarnated as a large dog, while Xing Yutang was sentenced to be reincarnated as a small dog. After being reincarnated as a large dog, the man frequently roamed the streets of Shentian Prefecture, scavenging for food. One day, while lying on the street, he saw a merchant from the south passing by, carrying a small, golden-haired dog about the size of a kitten. The large dog studied the little dog closely and realized it was Xing Yutang reincarnated. Believing that the small dog would be easy to overpower, the large dog lunged to attack. However, the little dog fiercely fought back, biting the large dog's throat and clinging to it like a bell hanging from its neck. The large dog struggled frantically, shaking its head, wagging its tail, and barking loudly. But no matter what, the onlookers could not separate the two dogs. In a matter of moments, both dogs perished together. After their deaths, they appeared at the underworld's court to seek judgment from the king of hell, each arguing their side of the story. The king of hell intervened, saying, If you two continue avenging grievances with more grievances, when will this ever end? Today, I will mediate between you. He decreed that in the next life, Xing Yutang would be reincarnated as the son-in-law of the man he had wronged. The man was then reincarnated in Qingyun County, Shandong Province. At the age of 28, he passed the provincial examination. He had a daughter who was elegant, gentle, and virtuous, with both grace and beauty. Many prominent aristocratic families in the region sent marriage proposals, offering generous gifts, but the man declined them all. One day, while traveling to a nearby county, he encountered the provincial examiner hosting an evaluation for scholar candidates. The top-ranked scholar, Li Sheng, turned out to be Xing Yutang reincarnated. The man invited Li Sheng to stay at his lodging, treating him with exceptional hospitality. During their conversations, he inquired about Li Sheng's family situation and learned that he was still unmarried. Seizing the opportunity, the man proposed a marriage between his daughter and Li Sheng. Outsiders assumed he was merely showing appreciation for Li Sheng's talent, unaware of the karmic ties between them from past lives. Before long, Li Sheng married the man's daughter, and the couple shared a loving and harmonious relationship. However, Li Sheng, proud of his intellect, often belittled his father-in-law and rarely visited his household, sometimes not showing up for an entire year. Despite this, the father-in-law remained patient and accommodating. Later, when Li Sheng fell on hard times and repeatedly failed his exams, the father-in-law spared no effort in seeking opportunities to help him. Eventually, Li Sheng achieved success in his career. This reconciliation dissolved their previous animosity, and the bond between them grew as close as that of a father and son. Because of one rejection, the enmity spanned 3 lifetimes, and the hatred ran so deep. Though the King of Hell's mediation was appropriate, there are countless grievances like this under the heavens. Could it be that all successful examiners' sons-in-law are reincarnated spirits of those who once cried out in despair in the underworld after being wrongfully disqualified? The Pavilion Long Court. Shi Taipu, a native of Mount Tai, had a peculiar passion for painting talismans, chanting incantations, and mastering the arts of summoning gods and banishing spirits. One day, a wandering Taoist encountered him and, impressed by his intelligence, accepted him as a disciple. The Taoist opened a bookcase adorned with intricate carvings and retrieved 2 scrolls. The first was titled Exorcising Foxes, and the second, Banishing Ghosts. The Taoist passed the second scroll to Shi, saying, "Study this diligently, and you shall have wealth, food, and beautiful women." Curious, Shi asked for his master's name. The Taoist replied, "I am Wang Qicheng from Xuandi Temple in Beizhen Village, Bianzhou." He stayed with Shi for a few days, thoroughly teaching him the spells and incantations before departing. From then on, Shi became a renowned practitioner of exorcism and warding off malevolent spirits. People flocked to him with gifts of silver and goods, beseeching his help. One day, an elderly man arrived, introducing himself as Mr. Wang. Displaying an array of fine silver and silk, he pleaded, "My daughter has fallen victim to a ghostly illness and is in grave danger. I beg you to come in person and save her." Hearing that the situation was dire, Shi declined the gifts and agreed to accompany the old man to his home. After traveling over 10 miles, they arrived at a mountain village where Wang's residence stood resplendent, exuding wealth and refinement. Inside, Shi was led to the young woman's chamber. She lay weakly beneath a sheer gauze canopy. Her maids lifted the curtain with delicate hooks, revealing a girl of about 14 or 15, her breath faint and her face pallid and gaunt. As she approached, the girl suddenly opened her eyes and murmured, "The good healer has come." The household erupted in joy, for she had not spoken a word in days. After retreating from her room, she inquired further about her illness. The old man explained, "During the day, a young man often comes to lie with her, but whenever we try to catch him, he vanishes. Before long, he returns. I suspect he's a ghost." She pondered this and replied, "If he's a ghost, banishing him will be simple. But if he's a fox spirit, I fear I lack the means to deal with him." The old man shook his head fervently. "He's no fox spirit, I'm certain of it." She crafted a talisman and gave it to him, then stayed the night at the household. At midnight, a young man, immaculately dressed, entered Shi's room. Startled but curious, Shi stood and addressed him, suspecting he might be a relative of the host. The youth smiled faintly. "I am a ghost," he admitted. But know this, the Wang family are all fox spirits. I happen to fall in love with their daughter Hongting and have lingered here for a time. Ghosts troubling foxes does not harm one's karma. Why then should you, an outsider, side with them and break apart our bond? By the way, the ghost added, Hongting's elder sister, Changting, is a beauty without equal. I have kept her chaste and preserving her for someone worthy, namely you. If they agree to give her hand to you in marriage, then you may cure Hongting's illness. When the time comes, I shall leave of my own accord. She, intrigued and flattered, agreed to the ghost's proposal. That night, the ghostly young man did not return, and the sick girl, Hongting, suddenly regained consciousness. By morning, Mr. Wang was overjoyed and hurried to inform Xi, inviting him inside to examine her. Xi burned the old talisman and proceeded to assess the patient. As he entered the room, he noticed a young woman standing near the embroidered curtains. Her beauty was otherworldly, like a celestial being descended to earth. Xi immediately recognized her as Changting, the elder sister. After examining Hongting, Xi requested a bowl of water to sprinkle around the room. Changting quickly brought it to him, her every movement exuding grace, her gaze captivating. Xi found himself utterly entranced, his thoughts straying far from the ghostly troubles at hand. Exiting the inner chamber, he hastily bid Mr. Wang farewell, citing the need to prepare medicine, and left. Days passed without his return. Meanwhile, the ghost's behavior grew increasingly brazen. Save for Changting, the ghost enchanted and seduced the household's women, from maids to wives. Desperate, Mr. Wang sent a servant to summon Xi again. This time, Xi feigned illness and refused to go. The next day, Mr. Wang himself arrived at Xi's door. Xi hobbled out on a crutch, pretending to suffer from an injured leg. Bowing respectfully, Mr. Wang asked about Xi's ailment. Xi sighed. Such is the plight of a bachelor. Last night, a maid tripped while changing the kettle, spilling boiling water and scalding my legs. Mr. Wang probed further. Why haven't you remarried? Xi replied, I can't seem to find a family as upright as yours. Silent, Mr. Wang departed, but as he left, Xi called after him, Once I've recovered, I'll visit again. No need for further trouble on your part. A few days later, Mr. Wang returned. This time, Xi limped out to meet him. After a polite exchange, Mr. Wang finally said, My wife and I have discussed it. If you can rid us of the ghost and restore peace to our home, I'm willing to give you my daughter, Changting, in marriage. She is 17 and of age. Overjoyed, Xi fell to his knees and kowtowed. With such generosity, how could I let my minor affliction hold me back? He immediately mounted his horse and rode back with Mr. Wang. Upon arriving, Xi tended to Hongting's illness and, anxious to secure the agreement, requested to formalize the betrothal with Mrs. Wang. The matriarch reassured him, How could you doubt us? She handed him Changting's golden hairpin as a token of their promise. Xi knelt to pay his respects to his future mother-in-law and proceeded to cleanse the household of the ghostly disturbances, sparing no effort. Only Changting, secluded in the inner chambers, remained unseen. Xi prepared a protective talisman and instructed the maids to deliver it to her. That night, tranquility returned, and the ghost was nowhere to be found. Even Hongting's illness seemed to vanish as Xi sprinkled holy water over her. Xi intended to depart the following day, but Mr. Wang warmly insisted he stay. That evening, a lavish feast was prepared with delicacies and fine wines offered generously. Late into the night, Mr. Wang excused himself, leaving Xi to retire. As Xi lay down to rest, a rapid knock startled him. Rising to open the door, he found Changting slipping inside, her face pale with fear. They plan to kill you tonight, she whispered urgently. You must flee at once. Xi's heart raced, his face drained of color. Scaling the courtyard wall, he fled into the darkness. Far off, he spotted flickering flames and ran toward them, discovering villagers hunting by torchlight. Once their hunt ended, he returned to the village with them. Xi was consumed by anger and frustration, with no one to whom he could appeal for justice. He considered traveling to Bianzhou to seek out his master, Wang Chicheng, but the thought of his bedridden father weighed on him. Caught in indecision, he brooded day and night. Then, unexpectedly, 2 carriages arrived at his doorstep. To his astonishment, Mrs. Wang and Changting had come. Mrs. Wang explained, You fled that night without resolving the marriage. Why not discuss it now? Seeing Changting, Xi's resentment melted away, and he chose not to bring up the attempted murder. Mrs. Wang quickly arranged for the couple to bow before the heavens and earth in marriage. She wanted to host a banquet to honor his new mother-in-law, but she declined, saying, "I am no idle person, nor do I have time for feasts. My husband's foolishness may have wronged you, but if you can overlook his failings for Changting's sake, I shall be forever grateful." With that, she departed. It turned out that Mr. Wang's plot to murder Xi had been unknown to Mrs. Wang. When she escaped, she learned of her husband's intentions and became furious. She quarreled with him incessantly, while Changting, distraught, wept and refused to eat. Taking matters into her own hands, Mrs. Wang brought Changting to Xi against her husband's wishes. After their marriage, Changting confided in Xi, revealing the entire story. After 2 or 3 months, the Wang family sent for Changting to return home for a visit. Xi guessed she might not return if she went, so he forbade her from leaving. From that point on, Changting often wept in sorrow. Over a year later, she gave birth to a son named Huier, and they hired a wet nurse to care for him. However, Huier was a fussy child, crying every night until he was brought back to his mother. One day, the Wang family sent another carriage, saying the old lady missed her daughter dearly. Changting grew even more distraught, and she could no longer bear to stop her. Changting wanted to take Huier with her, but she refused, so she left on her own. Before departing, she promised to return in a month. However, more than half a year passed with no word from her. She sent someone to investigate, only to find the house the Wang family had rented empty for a long time. Years passed, and all hope of reunion faded. Huier cried throughout the nights, and Xi's heart ached with every tear. Not long after, Xi's father passed away, plunging Xi into deep sorrow, which caused him to fall ill. During the mourning period, his illness grew so severe that he could not receive condolence visitors. While in a dazed state, he suddenly heard a woman crying as she entered. Looking up, he saw someone in mourning attire. It was Changting. Xi was overwhelmed with grief and, overcome with emotion, fainted. The maids panicked and called out, prompting Changting to stop crying and gently touch Xi. After a while, Xi regained consciousness, initially believing he had died and reunited with Changting in the underworld. Changting reassured him, "We are not in the afterlife. I have been unfilial, unable to gain my father's approval, and have endured separation for 3 years. I am deeply sorry for failing your devotion. Recently, as my family passed through this area on a journey from the East Sea, we learned of your father's passing. Though I was commanded to sever ties with you and our son, I could not defy the bonds between us. My mother is aware of my visit, but my father is not." As she spoke, Huier rushed to her embrace, and she wept, saying to him, "You have a father, but now you have lost your mother." Huier wailed, and everyone in the household wept alongside him. Changting then composed herself and took charge of the household, diligently arranging the funeral offerings with care. This gave Xi great comfort, though his prolonged illness still prevented him from standing. Changting called on Xi's cousin to host the condolence guests, and only after the rites concluded did Xi manage to stand with the help of a cane. Together, they planned and completed the burial. Afterward, Changting prepared to leave, saying she had to face her father's wrath for defying his orders. But when Xi held her arm and their son cried loudly, she decided to stay for a while longer. Before long, a messenger arrived from the Wang family with news that Changting's mother was gravely ill. Changting tearfully asked Xi, "I came for your father's sake. Will you not let me return for my mother?" Xi reluctantly agreed. Changting instructed the wet nurse to take Huier elsewhere and left with tears streaming down her face. This time she did not return for many years, and Xi and his son gradually grew accustomed to her absence. One morning at dawn, the front gate opened to reveal Changting, who drifted in as if carried by the wind. Xi was stunned and demanded an explanation. Changting, looking weary, sat on the bed and sighed. "I grew up sheltered, finding even a mile's journey exhausting. Yet now I've traveled 1,000 miles in a day and night, utterly worn out." She pressed her for details, but she hesitated. Only after much urging did she break down in tears and say, "I fear what saddens me may bring you joy. In recent years, my family relocated to Shanxi, renting a residence from a local landlord, Mr. Zhao. Our families became close, and my parents arranged for Hongting to marry Mr. Zhao's son. However, Zhao's son was a lecherous gambler, and their household was filled with strife. Hongting eventually returned home, refusing to return to her husband. My father was angered, but kept her with us for half a year. Zhao's son, furious, hired a vicious man who summoned a spirit warrior wielding iron chains. They bound my father and took him away. Terrified, my family scattered in all directions. Xi couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the tale. Changting, offended, snapped, "He may be unkind, but he is still my father. I have been a devoted wife to you, with never a grievance between us. Now my family is ruined, with over 100 relatives displaced. If you can't mourn for my father, can't you at least grieve for me? Yet you laugh instead, offering not a word of comfort. How heartless you are." She stormed out, ignoring Xi's attempts to apologize. Xi, filled with regret, was left pondering the futility of their relationship. After 2 or 3 days, Madame Wang and Changting arrived together at Xi's home. Xi was overjoyed and warmly welcomed them. However, to his surprise, both mother and daughter knelt before him, weeping. Shocked, Xi asked what had happened. Changting said, "I left in anger, but now I find myself unable to hold out and must come back to plead for help. What face do I have left?" Xi replied, "While your father may have wronged me, the kindness of your mother and your love are things I will never forget. When I rejoiced at hearing of your father's misfortune, it was a moment of human weakness. Surely you could have borne it a little longer?" Changting responded, "On my way here, I met my mother, and only then did I learn that the one who captured my father was your master." Xi was startled. "If that's true, it won't be difficult to resolve. But if your father remains away, your family will remain separated. If he returns, it might be my turn to grieve, and our son to suffer." Madame Wang solemnly swore her sincerity, and Changting pledged her loyalty and gratitude to Xi. Xi then prepared to travel to Bianzhou to resolve the matter. After making inquiries, he located the Xuandi Temple, where Master Wang Qicheng had recently returned. Xi entered to pay his respects, and the master inquired, "What brings you here?" Xi noticed an old fox tied in the temple's kitchen, with a rope threaded through a hole in its foreleg. Smiling, he replied, "I've come for that fox spirit." When Master Wang pressed him for an explanation, Xi revealed, "That fox is my father-in-law," and recounted the full story. The Taoist master said, "This fox is extraordinarily cunning and will not be easily released." Xi pleaded repeatedly until the master relented. Xi then detailed all of the fox's deceitful acts. Hearing this, the fox squeezed itself into the hearth as if ashamed. The master laughed, saying, "It seems it hasn't entirely lost its sense of shame." Xi approached and untied the fox, cutting the rope with a knife and slowly drawing it from the wound. The fox cried out in pain, clenching its teeth. Xi deliberately slowed the process, asking with a grin, "Does it hurt, father-in-law? Should I stop?" The fox's eyes flashed with anger, but once freed, it slinked away, wagging its tail as it left the temple grounds. After bidding farewell to his master, Xi returned home. 3 days earlier, news had already arrived that the old man had returned to the Wang household. Madame Wang returned first, leaving Changting to wait for Xi at their home. When Xi arrived, Changting greeted him by kneeling before him. Xi helped her up, saying, "If you truly remember the bond between us, gratitude is unnecessary." Changting replied, "My family has now moved back to our old home, and the village is near enough for us to exchange messages. I'd like to visit my father and promise to return in 3 days. Will you trust me?" She said, "Since our son's birth, he has grown up without his mother, yet he hasn't perished. I've grown accustomed to living alone all these years. Unlike Zhao Gongzi, I've chosen to repay your father with kindness rather than resentment. I've done my part for you. If you don't return, it would be your failure to honor our bond. Even though we live close, I will no longer concern myself with it. What's there not to trust?" The next day, Changting went to her parents' home and returned within 2 days. She asked, "Why did you return so quickly?" Changting replied, "My father couldn't stop talking about how you humiliated him in Bianzhou. I grew tired of hearing it, so I came back early." From that day on, Changting maintained close contact with her mother and sister, but there was no interaction between her father and Xi. The story of Xi Fangping. Xi Fangping was a man from Dong'an County. His father, Xi Lian, was an honest but somewhat simple man. Years back, Xi Lian had a falling out with a wealthy local named Yang. Yang passed away first, but a few years later, Xi Lian fell ill and took to his bed. Near the end, he told those around him, "Yang bribed the underworld's enforcers to come after me." Not long after, his body swelled up painfully, and after a few agonizing screams, he died. Fangping was devastated by his father's horrible death. He couldn't even eat. "My father was a kind and honest man," he said bitterly, "and now some malicious ghost has bullied him to death. I'll go to the underworld myself and get justice for him." From that moment, Fangping stopped speaking, often sitting dazed or standing motionless, as if he'd lost his senses. Little did anyone know, his soul had already left his body. Fangping felt like he had just stepped out of his house when he realized he was utterly lost. Unsure where to go, he began asking passing strangers for directions to the county seat. Before long, he arrived in town and found his father locked in a dungeon. From a distance, he saw Xi Lian lying under the eaves, beaten and barely recognizable. When Lian spotted his son, tears streamed down his face. "The prison guards," he croaked. "They've all taken bribes from Yang's family. They beat me day and night. I can't even walk anymore." Furious, Fangping stormed up to the jailers and shouted, "Even if my father committed a crime, it's up to the law to decide, not a pack of corrupt ghosts like you." After delivering his outburst, he marched out of the prison and wrote up a formal complaint. At dawn, as the city god began his court session, Fangping burst into the yamen, crying out for justice and submitting his petition. Yang, fearful of being exposed, bribed every official he could and reluctantly appeared in court. The city god, having accepted the bribe, declared, "This case is baseless. Dismissed." Fuming but undeterred, Fangping traveled over 100 miles overnight to the prefectural court to report the corruption of the city god and his lackeys. It took half a month for the case to be heard, only for the prefect to beat Fangping severely and send the case back to the city god for review. When Fangping returned to the county, he endured more torture and humiliation. The city god, eager to avoid further trouble, ordered his enforcers to escort Fangping back home. But Fangping refused to give up. He sneaked off to the court of the King of Hell, filing a complaint against both the prefect and the city god for their corruption. The King of Hell summoned the two officials to stand trial. Terrified, the officials sent their cronies to bribe Fangping with 1,000 taels of silver, begging him to withdraw his case. Fangping flatly refused. Days later, the innkeeper where Fangping was staying warned him, "You're too stubborn. I hear the officials have already bribed the King of Hell. Be careful." Fangping dismissed the warning as mere gossip. Soon after, a black-clad enforcer arrived to summon him to court. On the bench, the King of Hell glared at Fangping and immediately ordered him flogged with 20 strokes. "What crime have I committed?" Fangping demanded as he was beaten. "Of course I deserve this. I don't have the money to buy justice." His sarcasm enraged the King of Hell, who then sentenced him to the firebed punishment. Two enforcers dragged Fangping to an iron bed glowing red-hot from the flames beneath. Stripping him naked, they threw him onto the searing metal, flipping and pressing him down. The agony was unbearable, his flesh burned and charred, but Fangping endured without crying out, praying only for death. After what felt like an eternity, the enforcers pulled him off, allowing him to dress and limp back to court. "Will you still pursue this case?" The King of Hell sneered. "My grievances are far from resolved," Fangping replied with unwavering resolve. "I will not give up." Enraged, the King of Hell ordered him sawn in half. Fangping was tied to a post while two enforcers began sawing through him. The pain as the blade bit into his body was indescribable, but Fangping clenched his teeth and endured. "What a brave soul," one of the enforcers remarked. As the saw reached his chest, the other enforcer whispered, "This man's a filial son and hasn't committed any real sins. Let's avoid his heart." The saw's path became erratic and jagged, making the ordeal even more excruciating. Eventually, Fangping was split in two. Moments later, the King of Hell ordered him reassembled. The enforcers pushed his halves together, and though Fangping could walk, the seam in his body throbbed painfully with every step. One enforcer, moved by his determination, gave him a silken sash, saying, "Tie this around yourself. It'll heal your pain and reward your filial piety." Fangping wrapped it around his waist and immediately felt strong and whole again. When the King of Hell repeated his question, Fangping, fearing further torture, finally relented. "I won't file any more complaints." Satisfied, the King of Hell ordered his return to the world of the living. The enforcers escorted him to the northern gate of the underworld, pointed him toward home, and vanished. Xi Fangping thought to himself, "The underworld courts are even darker than those in the living world. Too bad there's no way to inform the Celestial Emperor." Then he remembered the stories about Guanko Erlang Shen, the righteous and clever deity who was related to the Emperor himself. "If I take my case to him, surely justice will be served." Relieved that the two underworld enforcers had already left, he turned south and started running, but no sooner had he begun than the two enforcers reappeared, chasing after him. "The King of Hell suspected you'd try to pull something like this," one of them sneered. "And look at you, proving him right." They grabbed him and hauled him back to the King of Hell's court. Fangping braced himself for an even harsher punishment. To his surprise, the king wasn't angry at all. "You truly are a filial son," the King of Hell said with a strange calmness. "But you don't need to go shouting about this anymore. Your father's grievance has been resolved. I've already ensured his rebirth into a wealthy and prosperous family. As for you, I'll reward your devotion with 1,000 taels of gold, a long life of 100 years, and a bright future. Surely that's enough for you?" The King of Hell even entered these details into the Book of Life and Death, stamped it with his seal, and handed it to Fangping to confirm. Fangping expressed his thanks and left the court. On the way back, the enforcers grumbled at him. "You sly troublemaker, you've got us running back and forth like errand boys. One more stunt like this and we'll toss you into the grinding mill and reduce you to dust." Fangping glared at them. "You worthless ghosts. Do you think I'm scared of your threats? I can endure knives and saws, but I will not stand for insults. Go back and ask the King of Hell. If he told me to walk home alone, what need would I have for your company?" The enforcers, now thoroughly spooked, pleaded with him to turn around and head home. Fangping deliberately limped along slowly, stopping to rest by the roadside every few steps. Though the enforcers were visibly annoyed, they didn't dare complain anymore. After half a day of walking, they came to a small village. One of the enforcers pointed to a house with its door slightly ajar and said, "Let's rest here." Fangping sat down on the doorstep, but just as he relaxed, the enforcers pushed him inside. Startled, Fangping suddenly realized he had been reborn as a baby in the household. Furious, he cried incessantly and refused to drink even a drop of milk. On the third day, he died. His soul, still driven by the desire to reach Erlang Shen, drifted off again. After running for what seemed like dozens of miles, he saw a magnificent carriage adorned with feathers, accompanied by banners, swords, and spears. The entire road was blocked by the entourage. Fangping stepped aside but accidentally collided with part of the procession. The guards immediately grabbed him and dragged him to the carriage. Inside sat a young man with an imposing presence and a radiant energy. "Who are you?" the man asked. Fangping, still burning with frustration, poured out the whole story of his suffering and injustice. He guessed that this young man must be someone powerful, perhaps someone who could finally help him. After hearing Fangping's account, the young man ordered the guards to release him and instructed Fangping to follow the carriage. Before long, they arrived at a grand location where a dozen officials stood waiting. The young man exchanged greetings with them before pointing to Fangping and saying to one of the officials, "This man from the mortal realm has come to seek justice from you. Handle his case promptly." Fangping discreetly inquired about the young man's identity and learned he was the 9th prince, a son of the Celestial Emperor. The official he addressed was none other than Erlang Shen himself. Fangping took a closer look at Erlang Shen. The deity stood tall, with a full beard, not at all like the clean-shaven figure described in mortal legends. After the 9th prince departed, Fangping followed Erlang Shen to his office. To his astonishment, his father, the Yang family member, and all the underworld enforcers were already there. Moments later, a prison cart arrived, and out stepped several other prisoners, none other than the King of Hell, the prefect, and the city god. In court, they all faced off. As Fangping presented his accusations, every detail was proven true. The three corrupt officials trembled like frightened mice, their pathetic appearances laid bare. Erlang Shen immediately picked up his brush and delivered a verdict. A short while later, the written judgment was issued and ordered to be shown to everyone connected to the case. The judgment read, "Upon investigation, it has been determined that the King of Hell, though honored with his noble title and enjoying the Celestial Emperor's grace, has failed to fulfill his duties with integrity. Instead, he has sullied the reputation of his office through corruption and abuse of power. Parading his rank with arrogance, he has betrayed the dignity of his position. Greedy and ruthless, he exploited the weak and drained the very marrow of the common people's bones. His heinous actions defy the virtues expected of a subject of the heavens. Thus, he shall be cleansed with the waters of the western river to wash away his filth. He shall then be subjected to the burning heat of the iron bed of the eastern wall, so he may taste the agony of fire. As for the city god and the prefect, you were entrusted with overseeing the people in accordance with the emperor's will. Though your positions were modest, true loyalty and dedication require neither status nor privilege. Even under pressure from superiors, a person of principle would never compromise their integrity. Yet you behaved like predators, preying upon the weak while colluding with each other to exploit the poor. You acted with cunning deceit, crafting schemes without regard for the suffering of those less fortunate. Such vile corruption makes you nothing but wolves disguised in human skin. For this you shall have your marrow extracted and your hides flayed. You are sentenced to death in the underworld and will be reborn as livestock, stripped of all human dignity. As for the underworld enforcers, though you were reduced to the ranks of the ghostly, you still had a chance to redeem yourselves through good deeds and earn reincarnation as humans. Instead, you became instruments of oppression, compounding the suffering of the innocent and committing grievous sins. Arrogant and cruel, you obstructed the path of justice. Your tyrannical ways have terrorized the underworld, turning even the mention of enforcers into a cause for fear. Thus, you shall be dismembered on the execution ground and have your sinews and bones boiled in the cauldron. And the Yang clan member, a man of wealth but utterly devoid of virtue, conniving and treacherous. Your ill-gotten gold filled the underworld with a sinister fog that corrupted even the court of the King of Hell. The stench of your copper coins tainted the heavens, plunging the city of wronged souls into perpetual darkness. Your money manipulated ghostly officials and even swayed divine beings. All your possessions shall be confiscated to reward the filial piety of Xi Fangping. The guilty parties are hereby remanded to the Eastern Mountain to face execution under the jurisdiction of the Great Emperor of Mount Tai. Erlang Shen then turned to Xi Fangping's father and said, "Because of your son's extraordinary filial piety and righteousness, as well as your own virtuous and kind-hearted nature, you are granted an additional 36 years of life." He instructed 2 enforcers to escort Xi Fangping and his father back home. Along the way, Fangping carefully copied down the judgment. Father and son read it together as they traveled. Once home, Xi Fangping woke from his dream and immediately instructed his family to pry open his father's coffin. Though the body was still stiff and cold, it began to warm over the course of a day, and eventually his father came back to life. When they searched for the copied judgment, it had mysteriously disappeared. From that day forward, the family's fortunes flourished. Within 3 years, their fields stretched far and wide. Meanwhile, the descendants of the Yang family fell into decline. Their mansions and lands all ended up in the hands of the Xi family. A villager who had purchased some of the Yang family's former land dreamt of a divine figure rebuking him, saying, "This land belongs to the Xi family. How dare you claim it?" At first, he dismissed the dream, but after sowing the land and reaping no more than a paltry harvest, he sold it back to the Xi family. Xi Fangping's father lived to the ripe old age of over 90, before passing away peacefully. The historian Yi Shi commented, "People speak of the pure land of ultimate bliss, but fail to grasp the true nature of life and death, which are divided by a veil of illusion. How can one comprehend the reasons for their arrival in this world, let alone the reason for their departure? And how could one fathom the mystery of dying after death or living after life? Yet loyalty and filial piety remain eternal, unchanging virtues. What a marvel Xi Fangping was, a truly extraordinary man. Thank you for watching Eastern Brush, Western Soul, where we explore the timeless wisdom of Eastern classics and the captivating beauty of both Eastern ink art and Western painting. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out the links in the description for more stories and art. Today's feature, The Tale of Xi Fangping, is just one of the 53 illustrated stories in our ongoing series on strange tales from a Chinese studio. This masterpiece by Pu Songling vividly portrays the dark realities of feudal society during his time. Pu Songling lived during a period when the Ming and Qing dynasties had shifted power, and the early Qing era was marked by intense class and ethnic conflicts. To consolidate its rule, the Qing dynasty implemented stringent feudal policies across military, political, economic, and cultural spheres. Laws were harsh, officials were corrupt, and landlords abused their power, turning society into a world dominated by tyranny and injustice. This oppressive reality deeply resonated with Pu Songling, who lamented the suffering of ordinary people, often moved to tears by their plight. His personal experiences, rural life, relentless struggles with the imperial examination system, and witnessing the devastation caused by heavy taxes and corrupt bureaucracy, fueled his dissatisfaction. Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio became his tool to criticize the government, expose social ills, and express his ideals. Through stories like Xi Fangping, Pu Songling masterfully critiques the moral decay of officials and the injustices of his era. His works remain a testament to his unwavering pursuit of justice and compassion for the oppressed. Stay tuned for more tales that bridge the wisdom of the East with the creativity of the West. Until next time, this is Eastern Brush, Western Soul.